Okay, hello to everybody watching this presentation today on mental health in sport. As I'm sure you're aware, mental health is very topical at the moment. It's been in the news a lot. If anybody's watched sport over the summer, then you'll have probably seen some of the athletes being happier to talk about their mental health problems. So I think it's very relevant to all coaches, leaders and instructors within snow sports and indeed any sport. So my own interest in mental health had really started quite some time ago. It started more with psychology. So way back in the early 90s, I did a postgraduate diploma in sports coaching at Moray House in Edinburgh. And that had a large element of it, which included psychology under the guidance of Dr. Richard Cox. And that really got my interest piqued about how people think, behave, and the whole psychology side of sport. Then 30 plus years later of teaching skiing, I decided to go back and study further. And that's when I went on and did the Masters in Applied Positive Psychology at Bucks University in England. And as part of that, I also went and did a meditation and mindfulness teacher training course as well, which is very much helped with the positive psychology, especially as an intervention to help people with their mental health. And then more recently over the summer, I did a first aid for mental health course with MH Scott Workplace Wellbeing, who are based in Edinburgh. This course was online and obviously looked a little bit more at what we might describe as the poor mental health side and the illnesses that people can suffer. So that's kind of my background and why I'm talking to everybody today about mental health. So this presentation is kind of in two main parts. And the first one is dealing with poor mental health and how as coaches, leaders and instructors, you can do that. And the second part then is looking at promoting positive health and well-being for the people that you work with. I mean, sport in itself is very much something that should promote positive mental health and well-being, but there are things we can do to make this even better. Before I get into the presentation as such, I want to have a little brief chat about the language surrounding mental health, because I find it personally a little bit confusing, and I think some other people do as well. And it's something that I've written about previously in my blog. And firstly, I think when people talk about mental health in the media, it's almost assumed straight away that they're in fact talking about mental illness or poor mental health. So from my background, coming from positive psychology, when I think of mental health, I think of it as good mental health and trying to promote good mental health, whereas quite often it's assumed we're talking about mental illness. Clearly, people are sometimes, not very happy to talk about poor mental health or indeed mental illness because of the stigma that surrounds it. People are afraid to talk about it because of what other people might think, what their coach or their parents might think, so they tend to bottle it up. I think this is changing, and it's changing, as I said, right at the top of this presentation, because you're seeing high-level athletes much happier to talk about mental problems that they may be having and poor mental health. So the term poor mental health, good mental health are ones that I like to use. Another term that's used a lot is mental health condition, but I think this is almost a politically correct term rather than using the term mental illness. And then you even get things like mental health illness, which for me contains two opposite words, so it's very confusing because I don't really often hear people talking about having a physical health illness. They would tend to say they have a physical illness or talk about the specific illness that they have. So I guess what is the answer to this? Well, I think the answer is that we continue to educate people about mental health and mental illness. And obviously this presentation is going to be helpful for that. But I would say that coaches, leaders, instructors working in sport should be, doing more, getting more education and doing something like the first aid for mental health course that I did with MH Scott, can really help with this. So, I think this presentation is just the beginning of what I hope people will, want to do more and find out more about this whole area. So one of the things that is commonly said on the first aid for mental health course that I did was that everyone has mental health, and that, this is clearly very true. Our mental health on a daily basis will change. Some days we feel low, some days we feel much better. So it's very, very fluid, and it's changing all the time because of how we're handling the stressors of life. There are lots of things that we have to deal with, and athletes in sport clearly have a huge amount of things to deal with, which I'm going to cover as the presentation goes on. So we can see mental health as being on a continuum. This is my interpretation of a continuum. There are many other examples out there. If you just do a Google search, you'll find a few. And in the middle I have 0, so where we're just kind of existing. Then going to the good end, you can have good mental health, and that can even go into flourishing. And I would see flourishing as being more than just mental health, because it encompasses well-being. So again, I'll cover this later in the presentation as to what exactly I'm talking about with well-being. Then at the other end, we can have poor mental health, and that can obviously spiral into mental illness if enough stressors accumulate. It is important to point out, however, that if somebody does have a mental illness, that it doesn't prevent them, if you like, from having good mental health if it's managed well. Okay, so that's really sets us up for the presentation. We're looking at the idea that we have a mental health continuum, and it can change on a daily basis. Okay, so moving on to look at this whole area of poor mental health. And I think to start with, it's important that, as coaches and instructors and leaders, that we have an awareness of both mental health and mental illness. It's important for everybody, athletes, coaches, participants of whatever level. I think in today's presentation, I'm not just aiming it at competitive athletes, but also at people who are participating recreationally as well. However, it's beyond the scope of this presentation to look at the whole host of mental illnesses that people may have. We'll look at a couple in particular later on. But, there are so many signs and symptoms that people can have. And just like physical illnesses, when you do a first aid course, a lot of these signs and symptoms will actually overlap. However, athletes and coaches need to be continually aware and vigilant about the kind of stressors, pressure, expectations surrounding, training and competition, and how these, if they kind of accumulate, can lead to poor mental health, and then obviously, if unchecked, could even develop into a mental illness. So I have a list here of potential stressors. It doesn't mean that this is a definitive list. It's just some that I've put together. And I'm going to take you through each one in turn. So just to go quickly through the list at this point, some of the obvious things that people have to cope with is training and improving skill. Performing well in competition is clearly something that people want to do, and that creates a whole load of stress in itself. Then funding, finances, and sponsors will take up lots of time and add to that. Injury is an inevitable part of any sport, and recovering from that. Then, particularly for higher level athletes, media commitments comes into it. Social media is a huge area these days, and it can be both a plus and a negative in many instances. And then we have the whole area of image, and the kind of image that comes with the sport that you're in, and what you're trying to portray. Then there's expectations that you put on yourself. There's the expectation that comes from other people, personal life events, and this kind of overlaps a little bit with outside commitments. The things that you're trying to balance and juggle with the sport itself. And then parents and coaches can unwittingly put pressure on people as well. And then traveling is a big area, which obviously as we come out of COVID now, people are going to be traveling a lot more again. So let me take you through some of these one by one. So training, first of all. As we know, to reach a high level in any sport takes immense dedication and a lot of deliberate practice. This area of deliberate practice has been covered a lot in recent books and by researchers like Anders Ericsson. So, we know that that takes a lot of effort from people, and that in itself can create a huge amount of stress. But it also comes from wanting to perform well in competition, and obviously from not performing well in competition. So this is where including mental skills training within an athlete's training program is vital. And that's where, as coaches, we really do need to have an understanding of how we can incorporate mental skills training into the overall program that people are doing. Then we've got the whole area of funding, finances, and sponsors. So the up and coming athlete is trying to simply have enough money to compete and participate. There's a whole host of things, from training camps, travel costs, entry fees, equipment. So it can be a real struggle. And then there's, time needs to be put out to seeking grants and finding sponsors. So, yeah, and obviously working as well to earn enough money. For the more successful athletes, then, there's the commitments that need to be met for sponsors as well. And, the top level athletes will have quite an entourage of people around them, who look after a whole host of areas of their performance and development. So that creates a lot of challenge as well. Injury and recovery. Yeah, a massive part of sport can be an incredibly frustrating and stressful time. It's a bit of a cliched statement, control the controllable, but it really is true. It's all you can do. So you do have to focus on what can be done rather than what can't be done. As I said, the media commitments are perhaps more relevant to the higher level athletes, but it's quite interesting that people seem to expect more and more from athletes in terms of being interviewed straight after events. And I've seen this in some of the high level events like the Grand Slams in tennis, where they're interviewing people immediately afterwards on court. I even watched a tennis competition in Continuum in France, where I live, earlier this summer, which was a kind of national level competition. And they interviewed the winner and the runner-up straight after the event as well. So even at that level, it's happening. And so it'll happen in Snowsport as well, where people are having to deal with that. And if we think back to the summer, then that's the likes of Naomi Osaka in tennis. That was one of the things that she particularly talked about struggling with, was the media commitments and how that impacted on her mental health in a poor way. As I said, social media has both positive and negative sides to it. And I think the biggest problem is that people seem to be quite happy to write things on social media that they would never say to someone personally. So you can get a lot of comments that are quite hurtful and really cause a lot of distress. So, limiting how much time is spent can be a useful strategy. Whether as coaches we can influence that with our athletes, perhaps is a difficult thing, but even in snow sports, you find that people will be riding the chairlifts and on social media the whole time. So it's something we can perhaps at least talk about with our athletes. And then image, trying to portray a particular type of image. Different sports perhaps are place more stress on in this way, but as I said here, sports like dancing, figure skating, gymnastics, etc., which are weight sensitive, can create a lot of stress and anxiety for people. So trying to look a certain way. And then we have expectations from yourself and from other people. The things you're trying to achieve will create those quite a lot of stress, trying to score enough ranking points to make a particular competition to qualify for the Olympics. So I think what's really important here is to remember why you're actually engaged in the activity and to make sure that you're doing it for the right reasons, that there's enough intrinsic motivation there. So you're doing it for the love of the sport itself, and not just for the external rewards that might come along. In reality, it's always going to be a balance between intrinsic and extrinsic, but the intrinsic is really, really important. And that's why it's important that you find ways to train and to participate in sport that helps that. You know, for me in skiing, one of the things that's important is to have enough variety in your training, so that, you know, I see it out with the French coaches in the Club de Sport in France, where they actually allow their athletes to just go and ski the whole mountain and have fun. And they're not always, you know, focused on just getting gait training all the time. So it's finding that balance that keeps people loving the sport, because, you know, otherwise the external rewards take over, and you can easily burn out, just fall out of love with the sport. It's what others are expecting as well. Parents and coaches can unwittingly put an awful lot of pressure onto, you know, their athletes. And of course, you have personal life events. So, you know, what we're really talking about here is that coaches need to be aware of what's going on in their athletes' lives. You know, as instructors as well, we want to find out about, you know, the guests that we're taking on the mountain, what's going on in the rest of their lives, because it could be something that's impacting their ability to perform as well as they could. So that's just being caring with people. But clearly there's big things can happen in life, and bereavement is one of those things that always comes along, and that can clearly lead to other, not just poor mental health, but could go into anxiety, depression, as I said, alcohol abuse, panic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, are all things that could, you know, come about because of major life traumas. And there's outside commitments, huge area that people have to deal with, and this really is time management. How do I balance the commitments that I need to give to practicing, to reaching the level I want to in the sport, and at the same time balance all of the other things that are going on in life. So, you know, it's a difficult balance. There's no right answer here, because on the one hand, it clearly does take an awful lot of effort to get to the level that you need to get to. But on the other hand, you know, there are other things in life that are just as important, you know, friends and family. So you do have to find a balance. And again, I think it's important to talk about these things. And I think having those conversations between coach and athlete is really important. And I touched on this already, that parents and coaches can unwittingly create pressure, you know, on children, because they can often want them to do well, you know, because they've perhaps passionate about the sport themselves, and they really, you know, clearly, particularly parents, just want to see success for their children. But it's important that they don't put too much pressure on that. I think the final point I made there was, it's one I've been aware of as well, is that, you know, because parents are funding their children, that can create a lot. The athlete or the child themselves feels they have to deliver, you know, for all the effort and sacrifices that their parents may have made. So again, just being aware of that is important. And then traveling, you know, as I said, we're coming out of COVID now, and people are getting back to traveling again. So this can be a tedious time, but it can also be it can be a very productive time. And this is one of the areas that I've talked about before. My presentation last year, I talked about how to use ski lift riding time more productively, but traveling generally is a time that can be very well used. And as I said earlier in the presentation, the onus is on coaches to try and build mental training skills into the overall training program of athletes. And one way to do that is to make use of traveling time. The thing that I hear from athletes is, we've got so much to do. There's so much to fit into the program, whether it's technical training, physical fitness, preparation, etc. There's an awful lot there to be done. And then you land them with some more mental training skills and think, oh, how on earth am I going to fit that in as well? So traveling time is brilliant time for doing, you know, meditation type stuff, mindfulness. etc., can all be very easily integrated into travel. So I'll have a quick look at a couple of the most common mental illnesses. As I said, I'm not going to go through the whole host of things, but the two that perhaps are talked about most and are most relevant to us are depression and anxiety. There are links to all of the other mental illnesses that we hear about at the end of this presentation, so we'll go over those at the end. But the other thing to say about depression and anxiety is they quite often can lead to other disorders or are linked to other disorders. So depression, as it says here, is someone who feels sad and unhappy for an extended period of time to a point where it affects their ability to function normally. Is said to have depression. Again, sometimes I think there's a little bit of confusion around depression because it's a common term that we use. It's just say, oh, I feel quite depressed today. And it doesn't mean that you are actually clinically depressed, but if it's actually affecting your ability to function normally, then I think that's very much when you're going into the realm of being seriously depressed. Some of the signs and symptoms are listed here, but you as a coach would be looking out for low mood, lack of energy, lack of interest and motivation where previously there was, changes in appetite, insomnia, etc. So you're really just being aware of what's going on with your charges to make sure that there isn't some big change in what they've been like before. And then anxiety. Clearly, anxiety is a normal feeling when you think something unpleasant may happen in the future. So when you feel that an upcoming situation is difficult or challenging, or when you feel threatened in some way. So feelings associated with anxiety will include worry, fear, tension, sense of dread, etc. So very common, but it's something that can be quite debilitating if it actually takes serious effect. So as it says here, it could be severe or it could be quite mild, and prior to a competitive performance, or we're going to the idea of coaches taking their coaching exams as well. These are all times that can cause quite a bit of anxiety. As I said, there's lots of different mental illnesses, but even within anxiety, we have different they can lead to different forms of anxiety. We've got, as I said here, general anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, social anxiety disorder, to name just a few of those. And again, I'm not going to go through those in detail, but you can find links to all of these with good explanations at the end of this presentation. Testing. So what's important to understand here is what is the role of the coach when it comes to poor mental health. And in the same way as with first aid, normal first aid, if we want to call that, we're not there to solve problems or to make people well. We're there to preserve life and prevent worsening. These are the terms we often hear on our normal first aid course, and to seek professional help as quickly as possible. So it is very much the same with poor mental health. We're looking out for the different signs and symptoms from a whole range of mental illnesses. They do overlap, but at least it's the changes in behavior that we're really looking at that are away from the norm. So that's the primary role, but it's not our role to diagnose what might be wrong with the person, with the athlete. And as I say here, so similar to the first aider for mental health, which is the course that I did recently, we're being aware of the signs and symptoms of poor mental health. We're getting to know some of the more common signs and symptoms of mental illnesses, and we're being able to engage in or initiate supportive conversations with people. A key aspect is to just listen non-judgmentally, to be there for somebody. And if we do feel there is a risk of self-harm or suicide, then that obviously is very serious if that comes up in the conversation. But one of the key aspects is that we're able to signpost people to the support that they might need and encourage professional support. Okay, so that's the role of the coach when it comes to dealing with poor mental health. Okay, time out. Testing. Okay, yep. So at this point, I'm going to just see if anybody has any questions before I move on to the next part of the presentation.
Yeah, Derek, one question for me. So you explained that people are often externally motivated and seek extrinsic reward. How can you encourage coaches? Sorry, how can a coach encourage participants to seek internal reward and have a greater focus on intrinsic motivations?
Okay, that's great, Niamh, thank you. Yeah, I think I touched on this, but for me, the key aspect is that people keep loving what they're doing and loving their sport. So in this case, Snowsport. So I think coaches need particularly to make their training as, have enough variety in their training so that love of the sport remains. So they really need to think about how they structure their programs. And again, whether it's working with an athlete or with a recreational skier or snowboarder, whatever aspect of snow sports are in, creating some variety is keeping people's interest. So if people remain interested, then they're more likely to enjoy what they're doing and therefore be doing it for its own sake. One of the things I talked about last year with regard to intrinsic motivation was that when we do a sport for its own sake, this is when we can find flow, as the mental state of flow. And if you're always thinking about the external rewards or the external reasons why you're doing something, there's very little chance of you entering a flow state. So that's what you're trying to achieve. So I think the key aspect is enough variety in the training so that it's fun, and that way people are more likely to continue to enjoy the sport. Do you want to pause it there, Ian? Testing. Right, so moving on then to, I suppose, the area that I enjoy most here is looking at the positive side of mental health and how we can encourage that with our athletes or with our participants. And this is looking, if we go back to the mental health continuum that I touched on earlier, is moving from zero, where we're just existing, to a state of flourishing. As I said, flourishing is encompassing well-being as a whole, and I'll touch on that in a little bit more detail shortly. So how can we get people to spend more time at the flourishing end of the continuum? The first thing I'd say is that we want to develop mental skills and maintain a term I quite like, a good level of mental fitness. I heard that used recently and I quite liked it as a way of thinking about, we have physical fitness, so we should have mental fitness as well. And one of the ways to do this is to build your resilience resources. And in my book that I put out last year, Learn, Enjoy, Flow and Grow, I had this acronym called ACT in it, and it stands for action, so that we're learning new skills, we're challenging ourselves, we're trying to experience flow, we're prepared to fail, we're allowed to fail as well. And all of these things will help to start building your resilience resources. We also want to use our character strengths and our strengths of skill, so effectively do more of what we enjoy doing. So these are important things for coaches to think about. What are people good at? Are they getting to spend enough time doing the things that they enjoy? And then learning to control thoughts. And this really takes it into the areas of meditation and mindfulness. Again, I'm not going to go through those in detail. I've talked about these plenty in the past, and there's lots of resources out there, but these are clearly ways that you can improve your mental health and work towards flourishing. So meditation generally and mindfulness are very important to that. So again, coming back to the role of the coach in promoting good mental health and flourishing is, again, to educate themselves about mental training techniques and to use these activities personally as coaches, as well as trying to get your athletes to use them as well. I think it's the same in any area. When you're more au fait with something yourself as a person, you're better able to teach it to others. And then to integrate these activities into the athlete's overall training program. Mentioned this already, traveling time being one of the best times for doing that. And then to really sell the benefits of good mental health, not only for the time that people are spending in their sport, but for the wider aspects of life as well. So there is a certain amount of selling the benefits to others. So as I said, well-being is much more than just good mental health. So we're encompassing the psychological aspect, the emotional side, the physical, the social, the spiritual, if you like. You can add in other things there as well, like financial and so on. But, from our point of view, these are the things we're really thinking about. And there are a number of pathways out there aimed at people achieving this kind of holistic state. If you go on to just the NHS information that is provided, then the pathway to well-being, the 5 steps that they suggest is that you spend time connecting with other people, that you're physically active, that you're learning new skills, that you're giving to other people, and again, paying attention to the present moment. So again, this brings us back to mindfulness and meditation. The great thing about sport generally, and particularly snow sports, is that it's the perfect platform for us to achieve all of these things. So we really are in a great position as coaches, leaders, instructors to help the people that we work with achieve all of these quite easily. So it should be fairly straightforward in some ways, but we at least are involved in a great sport for that to happen. And then another pathway to well-being is what's called PERMA, and this comes very much from my area, from positive psychology. One of the co-founders of positive psychology is Martin Seligman, American psychologist, and he came up with this steps to better well-being, and the P stands for positive emotions. The general thing is that we should be having more positive experiences and emotions than negative. The ratio is suggested to be approximately 3 to 1, 3 positive emotions to every 1 negative. Another researcher called Barbara Fredrickson did a huge amount of research on this, and that was the kind of ratio that was come up with from the research. Then we also need to have enough engagement in what we're actually doing in the activities that we're involved in. So this engagement is very much about flow, and being fully immersed in the activities that we're actually doing. And then we have relationships. Again, sport provides the perfect chance for that to happen, to have relationships with your teammates and other, even competitors, coaches, etc. So relationships are really important to your well-being. Having a sense of purpose and meaning is important, so that the sport can help provide that in the context of your overall life. And then clearly achievement, we need to be making progress in what we do in whatever areas of life. So in this case, in sport, people need to be actually accomplishing something and getting better, to kind of round off this whole area of well-being. So I quite like this PERMA. It's a simple sort of model, but it's something you can check back to and think, especially are people having enough positive emotions? Are they engaged and getting into flow? Are they building positive relationships with others and getting a real sense of purpose and meaning and achieving? These are just a few references there that I could have put tons of references in here, but the one I'll highlight there was the Seligman one, which is his book Flourish, which includes the whole area of the PERMA model. And I touched on my own book, Learn, Enjoy, Flow and Grow, which is particularly relevant to a lot of the positive mental health side that I've been discussing. And then we've got a number of resources for dealing with poor mental health. So the one I mentioned at the top of the presentation was MH Scott Workplace Wellbeing, and the course I did with them. They do a number of different courses, so well worth looking at. It's Edinburgh based. I was very impressed with how they ran their courses. Very experienced deliverers as well, with an awful lot of knowledge of different mental health issues that people have. And Mind is perhaps the most well-known one in the UK charity, so it's great links there to all the different types of mental illnesses that people have. And you've got Mental Health UK and Rethink Mental Illness as well. So there are lots of others, but I put those up particularly because you can find out about all the different illnesses that people can end up with. And then on the positive side of mental health, again, sorry for plugging my own stuff, but I've got a few in there. So I've got my author page, which has my book on it. And I do have a new book coming out in the next 2 or 3 months, which is very relevant to today's presentation. I won't say any more than that at the moment. I'm also doing some coaching one-to-one with athletes. So that's something I'm starting to do more and more of, who are looking to develop their own mental skills and make sure their own mental health is taken care of. Then another one here is Mental Health Ireland have a similar 5 steps to wellbeing as the ones that the NHS have below, but it's just a slightly different take on it. But you'll certainly see the similarity. It's just a nice little YouTube video. And then you've got the 5 steps to wellbeing from the NHS. That's the link to that. Then again, we've got courses that I've put online, which one of them in particular covers mental health, but there's some on flow as well. And then I've got some free resources available in the Parallel Dreams Coaching Academy Learning Hub. And then the final reference there, the School of Positive Transformation, was the school that I did the meditation and mindfulness teacher training with, but they have a lot of other great courses as well. And that's the final one that I was talking about, which is the mental health, flourishing and well-being through sport and physical activity. And that pretty much wraps it up. So thank you very much. And if there's any further questions, then I can take those in a moment. Okay, so have anybody got any questions they would like to ask?
I have a question, Derek. It's how do we as coaches incorporate mental health training into our sessions? And could you provide a couple of examples of specifically what that might look like?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think there's obviously a number of specific skills that we can try and teach our athletes, and so I'll just pick 3 that we can do. The first one I'd say is to look at this whole area of self-talk. So the kind of conversation that people are having with themselves. Sometimes people say they don't talk to themselves, but it's not true. We all talk to ourselves, and what we say to ourselves is really important. So actually, as coaches, we can encourage people to use the right kind of self-talk. And that could either be useful instructional self-talk that they could use. So you actually, what language should they use to help the performance that they're doing, and to encourage the right kind of focus. You talked about getting into the zone and into the moment of doing the task. So what kind of language would help with that? And then the other side, self-talk, is the motivational side, which, you know, we can kind of build ourselves up and get the best out of ourselves by using sort of positive motivational self-talk. So that's something we can make sure is actually happening in the sessions with our athletes. Then the second area is relaxation, actually getting people to learn how to relax properly. Whether that can be done in your normal sessions or whether this is an addition to what you do with people, it might be. You know, because you can engage in things like progressive muscle relaxation techniques where you could run that at the end of a session where you get your athletes to relax and go through an actual script of how to relax. But then if you have the skills, you could also be engaging in different types of meditation with people, which can have a relaxation element to it as well as improving their concentration, focusing skills as well, which meditation obviously does. And this whole area of relaxation will then lead us on to another really important skill, and that's kind of imagery and mental rehearsal. So we can really help our athletes to learn how to use imagery and mental rehearsal as part of their pre-performance routine, if you like, that they're doing. So we can get them better at doing that. And again, that's just simple things like how are they using imagery and mental rehearsal. You can use so many different aspects of it. You can use it to see yourself actually doing the activity. So if I was racing down a slalom course in skiing, I might see the course as it's coming at me, you know, as I'm doing it, and that can fire off our muscles in a way that actually makes the same sequence of movements that we will do when we actually physically go and do it. But you can also use mental rehearsal as a way of correcting mistakes. So there's a whole area there within that imagery and mental rehearsal that can be used as well. So that they would be my three areas: self-talk, relaxation, and imagery and mental rehearsal that could be used with athletes. So I don't know, Sarah, if that answers the question or not.
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay.